Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today, we're diving deep into the history of Ukraine, a land shaped by empires, wars, revolutions, and resilience. From its ancient roots to its modern struggles, Ukraine's story is one of endurance and strategic importance. In this video, we'll explore Ukraine's geography, its role in global politics, its fight for independence, and the cultural forces that have shaped its identity. If you're a fan of history that's packed with drama, power struggles, and fascinating turning points, this is the video for you. Let's start by understanding why Ukraine's location is so crucial to its history. Ukraine isn't just another country in Eastern Europe, it's a geographical and geopolitical powerhouse. It's the largest country entirely within Europe, covering a vast territory that serves as a crossroads between East and West. Bordered by Russia, Poland, Romania, and several other nations, Ukraine has historically been a gateway between Europe and Asia, making it a prime target for conquest and influence. Now, let's talk about Ukraine's key cities, each with its own unique role in shaping the country. Kiev, the capital and the beating heart of Ukraine. More than just a political center, Kiev is one of the oldest cities in Eastern Europe, filled with historic landmarks, religious significance, and a deep-rooted cultural legacy. It's where the early Slavic civilization of Kievan Rus flourished, and today, it remains a symbol of Ukrainian identity and resilience. Lviv, if Kiev is the political heart, Lviv is the soul of Ukraine's rich history. Located in western Ukraine, this city has been a cultural melting pot, blending Polish, Austrian, and Ukrainian influences. Its old town, with cobblestone streets and stunning architecture, showcases centuries of artistic and intellectual achievements. Odessa, this port city on the Black Sea, is a key player in trade and military strategy. Historically, it's been a critical economic hub, facilitating commerce and connecting Ukraine to global markets. Its strategic location has made it a point of contention in various conflicts, from the Russian Empire to World War II and beyond. Finally, we can't ignore Ukraine's strategic importance. Being located at the crossroads of Europe and Russia, Ukraine has been a historical battleground for centuries. Various empires, including the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Soviet Union, have fought for control over this land. And even today, its location plays a major role in modern geopolitics, as we'll see later in this video. So, now that we understand where Ukraine is, let's dive into its early history and see how the foundations of this powerful nation were laid. To understand Ukraine's identity, we need to go back, way back, to the medieval period when the region was part of Kievan Rus, one of the most powerful states in Eastern Europe between the 9th and 13th centuries. Kievan Rus was not just a random medieval kingdom, it was the cultural, political, and economic foundation of what would later become Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. Centered in Kiev, this early Slavic state was a flourishing civilization, known for its trade connections with the Byzantine Empire, its sophisticated governance, and its early legal codes. Imagine bustling markets, grand wooden fortresses, and rulers like Prince Vladimir the Great, who made a decision that would change the course of history, the adoption of Orthodox Christianity in 988. This religious shift wasn't just about faith, it was about aligning Kievan Rus with the Byzantine world. Christianity brought literacy, education, and architecture, influencing Ukrainian culture for centuries to come. Churches and monasteries sprang up, and the Cyrillic alphabet, still used today, became widespread. But all great powers have their challenges. By the early 13th century, Kievan Rus faced a massive existential threat, the Mongol invasion of 1240. The Mongols, under Batu Khan, swept through the region with brutal efficiency, destroying Kiev and shattering the unity of Kievan Rus. After this, the region fragmented into smaller principalities, each vying for control. While the Mongols eventually faded from power, Ukraine would never return to its former unity. Instead, it became the target of outside influences. And that brings us to the next stage in Ukraine's history, foreign rule under Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. After the fall of Kievan Rus, Ukraine found itself caught between rising powers. From the 14th to 17th centuries, much of Ukrainian territory was controlled by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This period saw a major shift in culture, language, and governance. While Ukrainian identity remained strong, Polish influence brought Catholicism and Western European ideas into the region. Ukrainian nobles and elites often had to adopt Polish customs, while peasants remained deeply tied to Orthodox traditions. But not everyone accepted this foreign rule. Enter the Cossacks, the fierce, semi-nomadic warriors of the Ukrainian steppe. By the 17th century, the Cossack hetmanate had formed under the leadership of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, a legendary figure who led a rebellion against Polish rule. These Cossacks weren't just warriors, they were symbols of Ukrainian independence, fighting for self-rule and a unique Ukrainian identity. However, in a dramatic twist, in their struggle against Poland, the Cossacks allied with Russia in 1654. At first, this seemed like a partnership, but over time, Russia tightened its grip, slowly eroding Ukrainian autonomy. By the late 18th century, Ukraine was fully incorporated into the Russian Empire, setting the stage for centuries of Russian dominance and Ukrainian resistance. And speaking of struggles, the 20th century brought even greater hardships for Ukraine: world wars, famine, and Soviet control. Let's move on. The 20th century was a period of immense suffering and resilience for Ukraine. First, during World War I, Ukraine saw an opportunity for independence. As empires crumbled, Ukraine declared independence in 1917, but it didn't last long. The newly formed Soviet Union quickly took over, incorporating Ukraine into its communist empire. Then came one of the darkest chapters in Ukrainian history, the Holodomor famine of 1932 to 1933. This wasn't a natural disaster, it was a man-made catastrophe orchestrated by Joseph Stalin. In an effort to crush Ukrainian nationalism and force collectivization, Stalin's government confiscated grain from Ukrainian farmers, leading to mass starvation. Millions perished, and to this day, many consider it an act of genocide. And then came World War II, bringing even more devastation. Ukraine became a battleground, caught between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Cities were reduced to rubble, millions of Ukrainians were killed, and the country was once again at the mercy of foreign powers. By the end of the war, Ukraine remained under Soviet control, leading to decades of oppression and forced assimilation. But resistance never fully faded. In fact, opposition to Soviet rule would grow stronger in the coming decades. Let's take a look at how Ukraine fought back against Soviet control. After World War II, Ukraine remained a key part of the Soviet Union. It was a major industrial and agricultural center, supplying food, coal, and steel to the Soviet economy. But despite its contributions, Ukraine was not treated as an equal partner. It was ruled directly from Moscow, with little regard for its national identity. Despite this repression, Ukrainian nationalist movements never disappeared. Groups like the Ukrainian Helsinki Group worked to push for human rights, democracy, and independence. Soviet authorities imprisoned and exiled many Ukrainian dissidents, but the desire for self-determination only grew stronger. Then came a major turning point, the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. When the nuclear reactor exploded, it wasn't just an environmental catastrophe, it exposed the Soviet government's incompetence and mismanagement. The disaster fueled growing resentment toward Moscow and strengthened calls for Ukrainian independence. And finally, in 1991, that dream became a reality. Let's talk about how Ukraine finally broke free from the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was one of the most dramatic geopolitical shifts in modern history. For Ukraine, this wasn't just a change in leadership, it was the moment they had been fighting for over centuries. As the USSR crumbled, Ukraine took a decisive step toward independence. In December 1991, a referendum was held, asking Ukrainians whether they wanted to break away from the Soviet Union. The result? A staggering 92% voted in favor of independence. This wasn't just a slight preference, it was an overwhelming declaration that Ukrainians wanted control over their own future. On August 24, 1991, Ukraine formally declared its independence, marking the beginning of a new era. But while independence was a victory, it also came with massive challenges. The transition to democracy wasn't easy. The country faced severe economic struggles, political instability, and corruption. Decades of Soviet central planning had left the economy weak, and now Ukraine had to figure out how to rebuild from scratch. Additionally, many powerful figures in government had been trained under the Soviet system, leading to internal conflicts over reform. But Ukraine's biggest challenge? Its complicated relationship with Russia, which would remain a constant source of tension in the years to come. And that brings us to the events of 2014, when this tension boiled over into outright conflict. The year 2014 was a turning point in Ukraine's modern history. It all started with the Euromaidan protests in 2013 to 2014. Ukrainians, frustrated with government corruption and their country's lingering ties to Russia, demanded closer integration with the European Union. When the pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych refused to sign an EU trade agreement, massive protests erupted across the country. These protests, centered in Kiev's Maidan Square, led to Yanukovych being ousted and fleeing to Russia. Russia responded aggressively. In March 2014, Russian troops occupied and annexed Crimea, a move that violated international law and triggered global sanctions. Crimea, home to a major Russian naval base, was strategically important to Moscow, and Russian-backed forces quickly took control. But the conflict didn't stop there. Pro-Russian separatists in the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, collectively known as the Donbas region, launched an armed rebellion against the Ukrainian government. What started as localized skirmishes quickly escalated into a full-blown war, with Russian forces secretly providing weapons, soldiers, and financial support to the separatists. By 2021, the war in Donbas had already resulted in over 14,000 deaths, countless displacements, and severe destruction in the region. Ukraine had been fighting this hidden war for years, but in 2022, everything changed. Let's talk about the full-scale invasion. On February 24, 2022, the world woke up to something many had feared, but few believed would actually happen. Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This wasn't just an escalation of the Donbas conflict, this was an all-out attempt to seize control of the entire country. Russian troops stormed across the borders, targeting major cities like Kiev, Kharkiv, and Mariupol. The world watched in shock as missile strikes, air raids, and tanks rolled into Ukrainian territory. The impact on Ukraine was devastating. Thousands of civilians were killed, cities were reduced to rubble, and millions of Ukrainians were forced to flee their homes. The war created one of the largest refugee crises in modern history, with millions seeking shelter in neighboring European countries. But Ukraine did something that surprised the world: it resisted. What many expected to be a quick victory for Russia turned into a long and brutal war. Ukraine, backed by Western military aid and economic sanctions on Russia, continued to fight back. The international community responded with severe sanctions, cutting off Russian banks, freezing assets, and supplying Ukraine with advanced weaponry. The war is still ongoing, and its outcome remains uncertain. But one thing is clear: Ukraine's fight for survival is far from over. Now, let's take a step back and look at something that is often overshadowed in discussions about war: the impact on culture and heritage. When people think of war, they often focus on battles and politics. But wars don't just destroy economies and governments, they also erase history and culture. Ukraine is home to centuries-old monuments, churches, and museums, many of which have been severely damaged or destroyed by the ongoing conflict. Historical sites in cities like Mariupol, Kiev, and Kharkiv have been bombed, wiping out priceless pieces of Ukraine's heritage. But despite the destruction, Ukrainians are fighting to preserve their culture. Archivists, historians, and digital projects are working to document and protect historical artifacts before they are lost forever. Efforts have been made to safeguard historical manuscripts, art, and records, even in the midst of war. Meanwhile, global organizations and governments are stepping in to help. UNESCO and various international groups are working to restore and safeguard Ukraine's cultural assets, ensuring that its history isn't erased by war. Ukraine is a nation built on resilience, not just in battle, but in preserving its identity. And as Ukraine fights for its future, it's also working to rebuild. Despite the devastation, Ukraine is not giving up. Reconstruction efforts are already underway. Cities, roads, and infrastructure are being rebuilt, with international aid playing a huge role. The country is focused on recovery, both economically and politically. A key part of Ukraine's strategy moving forward is its aspiration to join the European Union and NATO. Ukraine sees full membership in these organizations as a path to stability and security, but it faces major geopolitical challenges, especially with continued Russian aggression. The road ahead won't be easy. Ukraine still faces economic struggles, political divisions, and ongoing security threats. But if history has taught us anything, it's that Ukraine is a nation that refuses to be broken. And that brings us to our final thoughts. Through war, oppression, and struggle, Ukraine has endured. From the days of Kievan Rus, to its battles against foreign empires, to the fight for independence and survival today, Ukraine's history is one of resilience. Its people have faced invasions, famines, and wars, yet they have never lost their national identity. Ukraine's past struggles continue to shape its future, as it fights for democracy, security, and a place in the modern world. So what's next for Ukraine? Rebuilding, alliances, and geopolitical challenges lie ahead. But one thing is certain: Ukraine's history isn't just about the past. It's still being written. If you found this video insightful, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. We cover fascinating historical events just like this one, so if you love learning about history, be sure to check out our other videos. And let us know in the comments, what part of Ukrainian history surprised you the most? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.